Amid global economic challenges, China's Belt and Road Initiative set a record for global engagement last year, with infrastructure and investment deals topping more than $214 billion. A joint study from China's Fudan University and Australia's Griffith University found that Africa emerged as a leading destination for projects. Renewable energy and connectivity surged alongside traditional energy and transport networks. This year, China and local governments are prioritizing broader cooperation, stronger ties, and expanded people-to-people and innovation partnerships under the BRI. Could this next phase redefine how global infrastructure and trade interconnect? There's a lot to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Zoon Ahmed Khan is a research fellow with the Center for China and Globalization. Sourabh Gupta is here in the studio with me. He's a senior Asia-Pacific International Policy Specialist with the Institute for China-America Studies. Also with us is Sanusha Naidu. She's a senior research fellow and foreign policy analyst with the Institute for Global Dialogue. And Liang is a chair professor in economics at Willamette University. And Jan, why don't I start with you? The tally, so impressive last year. Chinese companies' engagement with 150 countries as a part of the Belt and Road Initiative reached the highest level since its launch 12 years ago. Talk to us about what all of this means and the tangible economic benefits for China.
Right. Well, so I think the report that you talked about really, I think, is a broader measure of the BRI engagement that includes construction of $128 billion and also investment of over $85 billion. So you're right, this is one of the highest record that we have seen in terms of engagement. And so I think that really defines some of these sort of claim that BRI is declining. So I think, BRI really serves China's strategic interest, right? Not only I think this helped to build the global South sort of alliances and coalition when it comes to sustainable development, but it also I think helped China to project its economic influences all over the world, and that means upholding multilateral sort of principles and promote mutually cooperation, and sort of trade and investment. And I also think that it serves China's own interest, right? Because China sees globalization, integration into the economy, global economy really help its own economic growth. And so it helps to really boost trade, investment, technological partnership, and as you mentioned, people and people changes and so on and so forth. So that really helped to boost efficiency, but also I think help China to secure some of the very essential commodities and minerals. And I think so that really helped in terms of both in China's domestic goals, but also its international sort of objectives.
Let's talk about the Global South. Zoon, BRI has been a cornerstone of development in many Global South nations. We're talking about Latin America, Asia, Africa, and in the Middle East. Noted Chinese professor Song Wei has talked about the impact there. I want to play a little bit of what she had to say, and then I want to get your reaction on the other side.
The Belt and Road Initiative has maximized China's cooperation with Global South countries. Through the BRI, we have helped Global South countries achieve infrastructure development, promoted the transformation of their resource-based economy, and advanced sustainable economic development. We have achieved a high degree of alignment and coordination with the development aspirations of the Global South. This has also driven the diversification of China's development cooperation options, thereby tangibly enhancing the resilience of China's economic development.
Let's talk about Pakistan. Certainly it's been impacted by the BRI. Talk to us about the impact there.
Actually, Mike, firstly, thank you for having me on the program. I happen to be visiting Pakistan right now. And the first thing I can tell you is that every person I meet who knows that I'm from China, they have a lot to talk about, already what they've learned, not only about China's massive investments, the opportunities from obviously greener energy infrastructure, digital advancement, also vocational and educational training, agricultural modernization, etc. But they're also deeply inspired by how far China has come. What I'll say is that, Pakistan is obviously one of the core partners in the Belt and Road Initiative. In 2015, the $46 billion intended infrastructure investments announced actually covered all of Pakistan's core requirements, from energy, transportation, border quadras, special economic zones. And since then, the project has really evolved to what I would say is, in the end, problem solving for Pakistan, the local governments, the deficits in infrastructure, mobility, also modernization that we have been facing. Another role that the BRI and CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor in particular, has been able to play is for us to conceive what is possible. For example, how to do rural revitalization. How can you find more creative ways to improve opportunities for communities in Pakistan that were maybe, not in the fold of the national grid, for example, or did not have access to better markets? How can we find more, creative ways to engage them? Additionally, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor from hard infrastructure has also focused on people-to-people exchanges and people-to-people, improvement. So there's a massive focus on trainings. There's a massive focus on how are the local communities in the vicinity of CPEC projects positively being impacted. There are tens of thousands of Pakistanis coming each year to benefit from Chinese scholarships, whether it's universities, whether it's technical and vocational education through Luban or other opportunities, whether it's short-term, projects or short-term education programs.
Sourabh, let's talk about this. China now logging $1.4 trillion of investment in construction contracts with 150 countries under the BRI since its launch. I mean, when we first heard about this, we're like, oh, this sounds, but I mean, when you look at it with the longer lens, it's really incredible, isn't it?
It is absolutely incredible. This is from about 2013, 2014.
Right.
This push, I thought it was very well conceived and thought out. The Japanese also did it earlier in the 1970s, but there wasn't a framework within which it was done, and therefore it didn't turn out to be as productive as it's been the case right now. I think with regard to what BRI has done, the most important things is, and where it's evolving to at this point is, it has obviously built a lot of infrastructure in developing countries. It affords the opportunity for those developing countries now to kind of fire up their domestic economic engines and then use those engines to export back to China. And it's going to be a virtuous circle. Second, I think the area where I think the growth needs to happen, and I think it would be very, very useful, we have now world-beating Chinese private companies in the commercial space, the BYDs and the Alibabas and all those guys, particularly in the area of renewables and, electric EVs and all those things. They're still a kind of a niche and rich product for a lot of developing countries. BRI should go in and help commercialize and help those private companies actually work in poor countries, incentivize the process, just like it had been incentivized in China. That will be an enormous area, so it won't just be state-to-state cooperation. It will be at the private level, and that will really dramatically expand it. Finally, I would say, and China is already kind of dabbling in this area, it's got its feet wet, it's in terms of debt relief. And, there has been the case from the kind of post-COVID era where there has been debt issues in poor countries, and China has now come to the table in which how to restructure those debts and how to provide debt relief and all. There isn't a good playbook, and this is China's opportunity to kind of, from an intellectual and policy standpoint, in the context of BRI, create that policy playbook with regard to how you provide debt relief and do restructuring in poor developing countries.
Sanusha, let me talk to you about Africa, because it's become one of the largest markets for these engagements. Belt and Road Partners on the continent saw more than $61 billion worth of engagement. That is a staggering 283% increase over 2024, according to the study that we've been citing. I want to drill a little bit deeper, but I want to get your thoughts on just that mammoth number that we're seeing.
Good day, Mike, and good day to the panel. I mean, I think it's a very important number. I mean, in terms of the percentage, it looks really high. But of course, we got to also remember that Africa's percentage of global trade with China is not as high in terms of where China does most of its regional and global trade, which is in its Asian markets, its neighborhood. So I think when you look at the number and you drill down in it, you kind of get the sense that it looks spectacular because it's coming from a low base. I also want to pick up a little bit on this nexus between the BRI and where the BRI is going, and of course, in the context of Africa's relationship with China. We had the announcement by President Xi Jinping recently that Africa will have 53 countries in Africa, which is all countries that have diplomatic relations with China, with the exception of the Kingdom of Eswatini, will have duty-free, market-free, and lowering of tariffs to access the Chinese market, which is really an important aspect in terms of how do you increase the trade engagement with China in terms of accessing the Chinese market. But at the same time, it also requires from the African side, and I think in terms of understanding how this actually leads up to the kind of access, what kind of access you're having into the Chinese market and what kind of products are going into the Chinese market, and how this will also lead back to whether this leads to a boost in trade and other kinds of manufacturing bases in Africa, particularly around some of those areas that were mentioned recently in terms of your electric vehicle market and so forth, in critical minerals and so forth. For South Africa, I think what you're going to see with the BRI in Africa and South Africa and other regions in Africa is more of the BRI becoming kind of domesticated in bilateral relations with China. So you have the China-Africa context, which is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, but I think having that at the domestic level and regional level will give the traction to the BRI in terms of how that relationship is crafted.
And you touched on this important issue about the zero tariffs, but let's talk about the other aspect, which is the increased tariffs. We're seeing them everywhere. The U.S. relationship with the rest of the world. One of the reasons why I wanted to drill down on the number, the majority of this big number was in construction contracts rather than investment. One reason was citing the impact of U.S. tariffs. So talk to us about that.
Well, U.S. tariffs are going to, I mean, we haven't in the case of South Africa, for example, and I can't say too much about other African countries, but in the case of South Africa, when we look at the impact of the tariffs, and people have been arguing that, it's going to have a negative impact on South Africa, particularly the geopolitical context, but also the relationship between Washington and Pretoria, that will have an impact on us staying in the African Growth Opportunity Act, which has been extended by a year. If you look at that, it really doesn't impact on how much of trade we do with the Americans in terms of the access point and the tariff impact. I think it's quite negligible. So based on that, I think this question of the construction sector is interesting because it is an important area in terms of infrastructure development and how much of investment goes in there. But again, the question is, does this have a kind of resonating effect for how this impacts on the zero tariffing as well in terms of access to the Chinese market in terms of products. And one of the areas that we are thinking about very seriously is how does this kind of build into, say, the agricultural sector, and how that may actually be an important actor or an important space for the kind of integration into the Chinese market. So I think there's a bit of a spin-off and a bit of an interesting dynamic between what we're seeing as the tariffs coming in from the US and how much does it impact on what sector, what industrial products, what kind of industrialization, and how that spin-off may actually have an impact for the kind of zero tariffing for the access to the Chinese market. And we need to have that drill down even further.
Yeah, very interesting point. Jan, let's talk about this study again, because it says that we could see more deal making, significant, although we do have these economic headwinds driven by the U.S.-led trade impositions of tariffs. But it said it's also possible that the engagement could actually moderate a bit. What do you see for 2026?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I do think that BRI serves China's strategic interest, both domestically, but also in terms of its global ambition. And I also think that it really helped to serve the global South countries. I think study after study, it has really demonstrated that BRI has the potential to boost the trade, investment, connectivity, as well as boost GDP growth. And also some studies have shown that with all these construction in terms of transportation corridor, it helped to reduce the concentration of economic activities. In other words, it also helped to reduce the regional disparity in many of the recipient countries. So I do think this is a mutually beneficial project. And so I think it will continue to thrive. But of course, it will be evolving. And I would also go back to the point about market assets and boosting trade. I think when it comes to export growth, it's not for at least for African countries and many others, it's not only that China is lowering the tariff and provide more market access, but China is also help countries to, in a way, enable them to improve their production capacity, to improve their productivity, and therefore the capacity to export. So when you look at the 2025 engagement, one of the biggest, I would say, largest signature project is the construction of a gas revolution industrial park in Nigeria. So this is to help to turn gas into fertilizers, petrochemicals, and menthem and others, and also the construction of hydrogen projects in Nigeria. So what I'm seeing here is, on the one hand, there are projects that help to boost energy efficiency and energy, sufficiency in many of these countries. They're really lacking, affordable and accessible energy sources to industrialize. And on the other hand, these kinds of industrial parks really help to boost their production capacity and allow these countries to be able to climb up, the value chain and to be able to export some of the more processing industrial products. So that's why I think this BRI is important, not only by providing the assets and also connectivity in terms of digital and physical infrastructure, but really is a capacity building exercise.
Zoon, let's talk a little bit more about that, because with CPEC, we've seen that as well, where initially it's ports, it's roads, but now it's evolving. It's CPEC 2.0, soft connectivity, artificial intelligence, digital payments, green energy. And this is getting back to some of the things we've discussed here in studio and with our other guests, this evolving kind of concept. The BRI, as we saw it initially, was just it's going to be roads, it's going to be bridges. Now it's much more, isn't it?
Absolutely, Mike. And that was the exact point, that when in 2015 the first phase was announced, it was obviously, about balancing Pakistan's energy mix. And interestingly, Pakistan was one of the few global south countries in this region, at least, which had a lot of renewable energy, which was not efficient, and very less, non-renewables. But within 2 years, China's advancing technology actually made it possible for the Pakistani local governments, for the central government, and for policymakers to, focus on more green energy projects. So with that also, as you mentioned, from hard energy infrastructure to transportation, what China has gradually done is to become really a partner when it comes to development. And that development is multifaceted. It is about, modernizing the way things are done. It is about helping local farmers think of ways, techniques, or to improve their yields. It is about helping young Pakistanis, become better at different skills, which make them more competitive. It is also about helping Pakistan conceive how can they, looking at different local examples within China, think of local connectivity, of regional platforms. So the way CPEC has transformed, I would say, if there's one word to put it, it is to really emerge, for China to really emerge as a true partner in Pakistan's local development. It is to also showcase that for Pakistan to focus on economic growth, we do not need to neglect our development challenges. We don't need to neglect addressing those challenges. Pakistan's, cities are also safer because of CPEC cooperation. Local governments are cooperating with the Chinese on how to, introduce smarter ways, smarter cities, where, obviously the local authorities are also able to enforce existing laws in a more efficient way. Normal Pakistanis, even businessmen, are able to access Chinese, events, Chinese enterprises, Chinese, emerging technologies to be able to become more competitive. So I completely agree with Yang on the point that the BRI is not just about infrastructure. It is also about conceiving a way of moving forward that is more resilient, that is more advanced, that is greener, that is more multifaceted. And it is about helping countries like Pakistan, global South countries, think more strategically and 5-year, 10-year visions, and also evolve what is possible for them to achieve. Well, so what CPEC and what the BRI is really doing is unique from what we have seen in the past.
Yeah, Sourabh, let's talk about that, because I think this is such an interesting concept that she's touched on. partnership. I mean, you talked about the policy playbook. This whole thing has evolved from, okay, it may be ports, but now it's green energy, but it's also partnership. It's like, what is going to be best for your country? We talked about, Jan was talking about citing Nigeria. What does Nigeria need? And this is kind of a different kind of, it's not a rigid formula. We're just going to do this. It's really kind of morphed, hasn't it?
Yeah. There's an irony out here, you have a preset Chinese menu. That preset Chinese menu used to be what the West used to offer. This is the way aid is going to be done. There wasn't much trade to it. It was aid, and we will offer it this way, and you have to swallow and digest it and figure it out. And that's very different from the way China is dealing with these countries. It reminds me back, I think ex-Premier Wen Jiabao had talked about it with regard to Africa. He said, we know what it was to go to bed with one meal or go to bed with an empty stomach. We know where you guys are because we've been there, and our destinies have been so joined together in that unfortunate respect. And so we understand, I mean, there has to be local ownership of development. And if there isn't that local ownership, it's just not going to have deep roots, and you're not going to have development. And therefore, there is that much more understanding between China and the poorer countries which came out of colonialism, of how do we conceive development and how we work together.
Let me ask you a follow-up on the empty stomach analogy that you brought up, which, you've seen how many people lifted out of poverty in China. And a lot of that, when you think about it, is infrastructure. It's just connecting and actually creating commerce and lifting people up. We're seeing that in other parts of the world as a part of BRI, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely, we're seeing, and that's why I think there's a great deal of enthusiasm and positivity in these countries about what their future prospects are. They see a horizon where they will just get richer and more stable and more prosperous, and that's why they want to have nothing to do with geopolitical bloc-based competition and all. They see a wide horizon and even in Asia, I mean, in Southeast Asia, 20, 30, 50 years, we can catch up to being an advanced nation. That's what they dreamt about, and that's the thing that which animates them. The one other point I will make is that, development cannot happen on the cheap. There's just no way around it. You can jawbone and talk about, I'm going to do this and they're going to do this, but at the end of it, it requires cold, hard cash. It requires sustainability, and you need to go through and implement. Just don't make commitments. Commitments need to be implemented. That's the area, over the last 10 years, how many, there was a Blue Dot network and this network, and then Mr. Biden and Boris Johnson had God knows what else, global partnership. I mean, where are they? You just can't talk about it. You have to implement it, commit and implement, and that's how you build trust. And development is something for the long horizon. That's how they've done it.
The talk is the talk. That's all it is. Sanusha, let me ask you about kind of what Sourabh was talking about. The reshaping, perhaps, of Africa's geopolitical thinking over the past decade as a result of this. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're seeing in Africa is definitely the idea or the shift in terms of how much China has featured and will continue to feature in the African landscape. I mean, bearing in mind that China, based on part of the issue of the experience of colonialism and imperialism, that plays an important narrative in the China-Africa engagement, the China-Africa relationship, showing that level of empathy that China has towards Africa in terms of where Africa's own underdevelopment has been in terms of relationships with former colonial partners. And I think when you look at China's trade footprint in Africa, I mean, it's really, shifted dramatically in terms of the present, the footprint, and so forth. But at the same time, I think some African governments, and in particular, the issue from the African side is around the challenges in terms of the trade deficit that China doesn't have or has in terms of Africa has with China, in terms of the fact that China seems to be able to have more exports into the continent, and of course what we are exporting into China is more primary products, and that I think ties in very nicely with the idea that we want to see this investment through BRI and through other avenues move towards that industrial capacity. And yes, it's true, industrial capacity actually leads to that kind of level of improving productive capacity at the domestic level. But we also have to recognize that we live in a very, very unpredictable global order, and that the trade winds that we currently see also have what we have to recognize in terms of not just tariff barriers, but also non-tariff barriers, which can also create impediments to the value chain. And I think that is something we have to think about in terms of how much that level of integration of China and Africa in terms of the headwinds that we see in the geopolitical architecture. When we see the kind of investment comes through, we see the appreciation of China being a reliable investor and wanting to see Africa grow and see Africa become much more than just a continent of primary exports of critical minerals. We also have to understand that this requires certain kinds of access to the Chinese market that also has barriers to it when the value addition increases. So I think one of the interesting things that would be important going forward for both China and Africa to think about is how do you actually create beneficiation at source, not necessarily to compete with the BYDs, but rather to create the kind of components that you now have in terms of creating that specification and technical specification of production in Africa around critical minerals.
Well, let me ask you about that, Jan. This is kind of part of this evolution that you've been talking about, and you know, obviously, with the increase here, there's going to be an issue over here. But could this next phase actually redefine how global infrastructure and trade interconnect, do you think?
Absolutely. I think the BRI is evolving. When you look at this most recent, 2025 report, and what we see a lot of investment is into the energy sector, into technology and manufacturing sector, as well as mineral and mining sector. And so I think what we need to pay attention to are at least two things. One is that we're also seeing a lot more, so-called small but beautiful, small yet smart projects. 700 of the livelihood projects were delivered overseas in 2025. And so that goes from, drilling wells to provide water access to solar panels for rural villages. And so I think a lot of these are helping to build the capacity, as Sanusha talked about, allow these countries and enable them to build their industry sector, to build their technological capacity in order to, grow and export. And I think the other important point here is that we're seeing a lot more private companies in China, especially tech, manufacturing, energy sectors, like East Hope Group, Xinfa Group, they're going out, again, to invest in other countries. And their projects are much more commercially driven, meaning that they have done their viability studies and make sure that these projects are really, meeting the financial, but also the actual economic sort of needs for these countries. So I think these are really important trends that we're going to see some, continued sort of investments in transportation infrastructure, for example. But more and more, I think, the Chinese investment will really focus on, what would really help to build capacity in these various countries, be it energy needs, be it, technological needs, or be it manufacturing capacity building.
It's been fascinating to watch, and history still being written. Thank you so much for your insights. I want to thank all of our guests. It's been a great conversation, and that's going to do it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Until next time, we'll see you then.